As you all know, League can be a very frustrating game to play. Getting tower dove on a big wave, losing a ton of minions, being flamed for not moving to a fight you couldn't go to, or any game with a Shaco on it on either team, a match can get annoying really fast. But the frustrations can start even earlier, all the way in draft phase, as 50% of the time you have to blind pick a champion and you're counterpicked into a matchup where it feels like you can't do anything. So in this guide, I'm going to cover some super simple tips to follow that can help you get through almost any bad matchup, no matter how one-sided it is for your opponent. By the way, every single tip I'm giving you, I'm going to show you an example of me against Masters or Grandmasters Elo players. I want you to know that you're getting good information that works against almost anyone that isn't a top-tier pro player, and these tips are especially useful in lower elos where players aren't nearly as proficient at laning and punish you less effectively. And right into our very first tip, it is the easiest thing you can do, just pick a scaling champion. You don't have to follow this tip, but if you don't really care what you're playing, due to the changes that Riot made to the game that we'll discuss in a bit, it is very difficult to build leads in lane versus players who understand some of the tips I'm going to be discussing later on. All of the top tier challenger players are constantly complaining right now that the laning phase doesn't really matter much these days, because if you just know a few concepts, it's very hard to shut someone down in a 1v1. As I write this, there is a mid-Kayle player who is grinding in Korean solo queue, which is an insanely aggressive server by the way, with constant fighting, and he consistently pops off despite blind picking Kayle of all champions. What I want you to avoid is a really bad mentality where I feel some players try to blind pick a strong early game champion so at the very least they can go even in lane or at least be strong enough to help at those early grub and dragon fights. Trust me, that is a bad mentality. It is far better to pick a champion that's always going to be useful at 2 to 3 items, where even if you go down in resources early, you'll still pop off in the mid and late stages of the game. Of course, I know most of you just like playing your favorite champions, so let's talk about those changes I mentioned earlier so that you can survive any matchup. There were 2 changes that most high elo players hate because they make the laning phase really hard to punish. The first was Riot adding home guards before 14 minutes anytime you base. These days, it is much easier to just take a bad recall timer and come back to lane quickly anyway, missing less experience than before. There's also death home guards, so even if you die in lane, you can just walk back to your tower quickly, letting you continue to soak experience. While those are helpful, the following change is what most pro players really hate, and you need to understand it to have a much smoother laning phase. Riot made it so that minion waves deal a lot, and I mean a lot more damage to other minions. This makes freezing and slow pushing harder to pull off these days, which were the main strategies for punishing weak laners. Basically, if both waves are left neutral where the minions are just hitting each other, the buff cancels itself out. Since the minions are focusing each other, both sides are dying equally as fast, so it's a neutral result as the extra damage evens out, right? But as you know, hitting your opponent draws minion aggro, and when one of the waves isn't hitting the other one, that extra damage can completely overwhelm the other side. Here's a simple visual to show you how impactful this is. We have a completely neutral wave here. I'm going to draw creep aggro one time, just one time, and look at how quickly my minions begin overpowering the enemy wave. What pros and high-elo players find frustrating is that slow pushing and freezing waves was a core strategy to building leads in lane. Harassing your opponent while slow pushing is a fundamental we've taught for years at Skill Capped. But if you hit someone while slow pushing these days, the wave will just instantly begin fast pushing towards your opponent. Likewise, it feels almost impossible to hold a freeze these days. To freeze, you have to actually threaten to zone your lane enemy, but if you hit them, it's very likely your freeze breaks because you draw minion aggro and your wave begins pushing into them. And just understanding this concept alone can make tough matchups 10 times easier. All you have to do is walk up to your opponent every now and then and try to be in range so they get baited and auto attack you a single time. Because they get minion aggro, the wave pushes into you much faster, allowing you to farm under your tower safely. Although this is very basic, it is extremely effective and it's something you can immediately do in your next game. However, the skill here is getting the range versus your opponent just right, where you only tank a single auto attack and no more. You obviously wouldn't want to walk too far forward and take a full combo to the face. By the way, notice how I did this trick while there was only 2 minions alive, but look at the end result. The wave is pushing so quickly into me now, and I'm barely getting zoned by this weird Ezreal counterpick because waves are so delicate these days that a single auto attack leads to outcomes like these. Along the same line of thinking, you can also tank enemy spells to get the wave pushing into you. So for example, if I'm walking up for a last hit, I'd want to stand on top of my own minions when tanking an AoE ability. This way the wave gets damaged and pushes into me faster. Or better yet, let's take a look at this Lucian game where I have a Braum versus a Nico support. Any ADC player should know how miserable this lane is for me right now because Braum is worthless into range supports early on. However, I'm keeping my cool and standing near my own wave. This way when she Qs me, it pushes the wave into me, and obviously dodging the spell on top of that is a double win, as now I'm just chilling waiting for the wave to push into me. Or if you're the support player like Braum here, you wouldn't want to just stand next to no minions and tank a spell for zero reason. He's just eating free harass this way. At the very least, if you're going to tank a spell, try to get value out of it by standing on top of your own wave like I typically am. I love giving easy, simple tips like these that you can apply the second you queue up for your next game and feel like you're getting immediate positive results. Unfortunately, as you guys know, the YouTube meta is to play for the algorithm, which means clickbait titles with topics that aren't that helpful just to get more views, and also stretching very simple concepts for more watch time. We're part of that problem as well, just like every other YouTube channel is. And what's worse is the randomness of the guides that you're watching. This guide is about dealing with bad matchups, and then the next one is going to be about how to close games out with Baron. There's just no cohesion, it's just a bunch of random information being thrown around. On our website Skillcap though, that problem doesn't exist, and we can teach you how to climb properly in the most efficient way possible. When you sign up, you can immediately watch our Essentials courses for every single role, which we update every season. These are step-by-step guides that build your fundamentals in the right order, setting you to move on to our more advanced courses where you can learn everything you need to know about wave control, how to improve your mechanics, and everything else you might need to climb efficiently. And while you follow these very clear learning paths, we also release our popular challenger walkthroughs, new sessions every week showing you how to abuse the best meta champs for your elo, supported with an AMA section below each video which we always respond to. And we back all of this with a 5 division improvement guarantee while you're actively using Skillcap, plus a 30-day refund change of mind policy on top of that, so there's literally no risk. So if you're tired of trying to improve by watching a bunch of random YouTube videos, then use the discount link below to sign up. Back to the guide for my next tip. This is a perspective I learned specifically by doing challenges back in the day where I put myself behind to prove you can always come back in low elo games. What's funny is that when I did this challenge years ago, I learned a simple mindset that I still use in my own challenger games to this day. In bad lane matchups, all you have to do is not worry about last hitting a single caster minion. You shouldn't care if you miss every single last hit. Let me explain why. When it comes to CSing, as you all know, the melee minions in front give more gold and are far easier to walk up to. On the other hand, the casters are further back, so when you walk up to CS, it makes it very easy to punish you. On top of that, they give you even less gold. Instead, think about caster minions like this. 2 waves spawn every minute. There's 3 casters per wave, so in a 10-minute period, that means 60 caster minions total. I want you to imagine the worst matchup possible, where you got zoned from every single caster minion last hit, you press tab and you're down 60 CS. But if you think about it, it's only 840 gold. While that is a lot of gold, you would think you'd be way further behind if you're down 60 CS, right? But also, keep in mind, you're never going to be zoned that hard in a lane. You're bound to get a caster last hit every now and then, even in the worst matchups. More than likely, in a really bad lane, you just have to give up 10 to maybe 20 casters the entire laning phase, which is around 300 gold at most. That's almost nothing. They might have an extra cloth armor or a longsword over you. It's almost irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Let me show you the opposite perspective, where I'm the one in a winning matchup versus someone who isn't following this concept. As the Hui with a Senna support, all we have to do in this lane is slowly poke Tristana down. It's obviously a really good matchup for us. But if you watch my Senna, she leaves the minions to go stand in the open, gets hooked, and the enemy duo gets an okay trade. It didn't end up being a great trade for them, but it's not terrible. Or at level 3, my Senna walks into the Nautilus willingly, and we get heavily engaged on. I'm just trying to make a point here. We definitely have the better matchup, but they have a chance of winning if they get a clean engage off, and my Senna is making sure they get that chance. With all that in mind, let's fast forward to level 4. I am clearly, and I mean very clearly, preparing to punch Tristana for last hitting these casters, but she tunnel visions on just 14 gold and walks into a perfect trade for me, and now she's half health over nothing. Instead, I want you to imagine a scenario where she gave up, let's say, 20 caster minions throughout this entire lane. Better yet, let's move it up to 30. 30 caster minions is 420 gold, lovely. But if Tristana and Nautilus kept their health up and find an engage where they maybe score a kill, they get the kill gold, assist gold, they deny me a wave, they maybe get a plate on top of that. That is more than worth it, right? And that's the entire tip. Just don't worry about last hitting caster minions. Do your best to soak experience, save your HP, and you will have a much better time in every bad matchup. As we just discussed, you need to be comfortable getting a little bit less gold than your opponent in bad matchups. So what's also important is making sure that you're spending your gold wisely, and my next piece of advice is to not rush tier 2 defensive boots to try and survive the lane. I see this a lot in mid, where players will sometimes rush Merc Treads versus things like LeBlanc, or in top lane, players might go Tab Eyes versus Aurelia or Riven. The problem is that your best defensive tool to survive bad matchups is often your ability to simply push a wave quickly into your opponent's tower. So rather than fully committing and buying tier 2 defensive boots, you should instead instead build items that speed up your wave clear and make sure you rush your first item instead. This is because in bad matchups, your opponent will often step away from the lane for any number of reasons. Maybe they have priority and they're rotating the grubs. Maybe they're basing. Maybe they're roaming to kill your team. Or maybe your jungler walked into mid, pressuring them off for a second. Having the AD or AP to instantly push a wave in like 4 to 5 seconds is very valuable, because once you've pushed, you can now play much safer. You can take a reset for free, or even zone someone like I'm doing here. Another problem of rushing defensive boots is that they might keep you alive, but anytime I see someone rush tab eyes or mercs, it's very easy to just ignore them, push a wave, and then just go roam around and kill their team. Meanwhile, they're struggling to push the wave with just their boots and no ability power. Having the ability to instantly shove waves is really important these days. Being able to quickly clear a residual wave can now give you two options. One, you can stay in lane and keep pushing quickly to threaten to take turret plates. Obviously, the more damage you have, the more you can threaten towers. Or two, if you can actually match their wave clear, you can now also match their move, whether they're going to grubs, dragon, top lane, or bot lane, it doesn't really matter. I was only able to match this roam because I clear waves fast and was right behind Vex the entire time. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. If you're Darius versus Gnar, rushing Swifties or tab eyes is obviously great. Or if you're versus Xerath mid or Blitzcrank bottom where you need to avoid spells, rushing boots to counter them is fine. In League, things always depend and there's never a 100% correct answer, but for the most part, clearing waves quickly is a really valuable defensive tool in bad matchups. Moving on to my final tip, you always want to think about whether you should exchange bases or not. This is my final piece of advice because you can't always do it, but it is very effective when you get the opportunity. Let's go back to this Lucian game from before where I've used the previous tips I discussed to survive Neeko's constant harass, and I managed to build a slow push and crash the wave. With Braum and I both missing a lot of resources, you would think that this is a good time to base, and I could, but I personally prefer staying here to keep the lane going. You should always ask yourself, who benefits more from basing? If all four of us traded recalls and came back at full HP, we would just go right back to where we started. Neeko, with a ton of mana and even more damage because she's just bought items, would spam harasses over and over again. It would feel completely awful. But as I crash the wave, I notice that she's currently out of mana. Even though my Braum is low, Neeko's threat is completely non-existent right now. If you fast forward a few seconds, you can see they're having a much harder time playing this lane out. Neeko's only able to go for a Q or E every now and then when she regens enough mana, and thus, Braum and I slowly but surely take control over this lane, and now they're the ones on the back foot. Despite us being in the losing matchup early on, they're the ones eventually forced to take a really awkward base just to make sure they don't die. This is a really common tip to utilize in sustain versus mana matchups like Vladimir versus Orianna. This lane is terrible for Vlad. The Orianna can just space him out and spam him with harass the entire laning phase. But around level 5 or so, typically the Orianna starts going so as Vlad, you would want to keep her in lane as long as possible, outvaluing her with your Q sustain. You wouldn't want to let Orianna base for free because she's just going to come back with a mana item and go right back to spam harassing you since she's not going to run out of mana anymore. So always ask yourself, who benefits more from basing? And can I stop my opponent from taking a recall despite being in a losing matchup? This can often let you turn around losing lanes into winning ones, as you just saw. Alright, those are all of my tips for surviving being first pick in draft phase. Remember, if you want to learn these types of fundamentals and more, all in a convenient location, then subscribe to Skillcap using the discount link below. Trust me, you and your LP definitely won't regret it. See you next time.